maybe edit them a little better, so it's not live, and then. Oh, I see. You were. I didn't know Google Hangouts itself had a chat that you were typing, and that's interesting. You said hi. I'm going to quit Chrome and reopen it. Wait. So
Oh,
you know what's happening there.
If you're recording this, I can't show what I was going to show anyway. Another time on an unrecorded call, I will show that to your son.
Well, is this? Are you still a NASA employee?
No, I'm a contractor.
Oh,
I kind of have work here and there with them, depending on the needs at the time.
Gotcha. Depending on if we need a fake moon set.
Yes, my specialty is faking.
His hoaxes.
Faking everything. Yeah.
Shooting things at the wrong angle, so that now we have two shadows that are conflicting. So now we have 2 points of light.
Wall behind this is actually the moon landing set.
That's where he is. He lives at the moon landing set. That's
Maryland. You're so close to Natalie the other day.
I know. I'm close to the conspiracy. So we've got that. We've got my own Monsanto conspiracy over here. So Bethesda is the epicenter of
actually all 500,000 people who would have to have kept the secret in order for the moon landing to be a hoax are all actually locked up back there.
I wrote about that. I wrote a blog post about that. Like a year and a half ago, because they came out with a study. I'm trying to find it right now so I can speak more intelligently to it. But they can't, because there was a study like a year and a half, 2 years ago, where they actually did research over how quickly any sort of conspiracy theory breaks down over time, and it was something like the moon landing was it might have been like 5 to 10 years, but something like vaccines causing autism was like not even a year. Cancer was like a matter of months, just based on, and they based it on models of like actual like Watergate and things like that actually like came out that were I guess it's not a conspiracy once it's found to be true, just really like shady dealings at that point.
Yeah, I would have expected it to be similar in propagation to actual disease, with different people, different levels of resistance and herd immunity, and perhaps more thoughtful communities and stuff like that.
Well, and even then, because all it takes is one person to for it to break down, and even then you're going to have some. I'm going to be sexist here. You're going to have some stupid guy trying to impress a lady, saying, "Oh, hey, did you know?" And then
I did this.
She's going to turn and tell somebody, and then she's going to tell somebody. Then they tell 2 people, and then
and that's done. It's over. So yeah.
It was 411,000 NASA employees, and then for climate change, it's something like 405,000 people would be in on the conspiracy for climate change. For vaccines, 22,000. Cancer cure was 714,000.
They must all be getting paid really, really well,
right?
You know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is nuts. Anyway, we have a show to do, don't we?
All right, we'll do this. Yeah. All right, and then we'll talk about because I mean this whole show is just going to be Jeff telling us things that didn't actually happen, because we've never been up there. So this is the conspiracy show. All right, so I will intro and then we'll get talking.
Cool.
Tonight, we are delighted to be joined by Jeff Nosanov. Jeff is a 3-time NASA Innovative Advanced Concept Fellow, former NASA JPL project manager, entrepreneur, space lawyer, and science podcaster with the show 5 Minute Science. His lifelong goal is to expand humanity's capabilities in deep space and beyond. So, Jeff, thank you for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And the way that this happened is due to Dan's Science Enthusiast stickers being on my laptop and us striking up a conversation in Quartermain Coffee Shop. So thank you, Dan, for the stickers.
Yes, thank you.
Said nobody ever.
Said me. So said one person once. Thank you for making stickers that actually, though, no, those stickers have brought a lot of interesting conversations to me.
They have.
Like, And only once did somebody ask me if I worked for a chemical company. But otherwise, it's been pretty okay. I only pretty much got asked if I was a shill once because of the stickers. So pretty good track record. So we're here tonight to just kind of nerd out about space because Jeff, I found out through a conversation with you, this is, I mean, where you've made your livelihood, but also just a passion of yours. So I want to start, like, before we get into kind of history of, little stories from NASA and space exploration, what's your origin story with this? How did space become your passion?
Well, it's been such for so long that I can only remember bits and pieces of the formative part. But when I was about 5 years old, it was during the Voyager Uranus Encounter in 1987. And I was at the Griffith Observatory with my dad in Los Angeles. And we were looking through the big telescope at Uranus. And he told me there was a spaceship there. And I sort of, in the way that I now see in my own 5-year-old face when I tell him things like that, I sort of accepted it at face value, but also really wanted to see it for myself. So I went outside of the telescope dome and I looked up at where I knew Uranus was, and obviously I couldn't see it. And I went back inside and looked at the telescope, and Uranus is bright and clear. And I did that a few times, and I'm pretty sure that was it for me. That it was going to be hard to top that ever. So I continue to aspire to top that myself, but and little I didn't even know at the time that spacecraft was built and mission operated by JPL, which was 10 miles away from the Griffith Observatory, and where I would work for 5 years, starting about 24 years later.
So it was just sort of this moment where you thought, this is so awesome.
Yeah, and I've yet to run into anything even remotely as interesting. So I'm pretty sure this is what it's going to be for me.
And so then, can you kind of trace the path that brought you personally to JPL?
Yes, and it's extremely bizarre and could not have been done on purpose if I had tried. So it's a story I tell people who were just graduated from college who are trying to plan everything that's going to happen in their life, and I did that, and very much did not happen, but I wouldn't have it turn out any other way. Anyway, so in college, I started in computer engineering. And I eventually switched to a degree at UC Irvine called Environmental Analysis and Design, which is basically a catch-all for a bunch of environmental science courses. Long story, but I had to take some pre-law courses, and I actually found it pretty interesting. And I thought briefly that I might be a lawyer, but I realized in later years that appealed to me because of thinking of the legal system as a system. And I now know that I'm sort of a systems thinking person. But anyway, fast forward, I got to law school and I started asking about space law because I thought, well, maybe that's where I can contribute. And I got this total blank stares. And one professor said, oh yeah, I think that's the thing. And I had some very significant moments of doubt. And this was in 2005, back when a legal career seemed like a good idea. And towards the end of law school, in the beginning of 2008, when the economy was crashing down, and the legal economy especially, really, which the house of cards that had been built on for 130 years was really falling down, never to be rebuilt. I was finishing law school, and I opened an issue of the Wall Street Journal that was sitting next to me on the subway one day. This is in New York. And I see the headline, University of Nebraska creating space law program. And I had, done some homework on space law, but I certainly had no clue or insight on how I could possibly get involved. And I thought, wow, Nebraska, space law, starting this year. And I went home and talked to my girlfriend, now my wife, and I said, so I kind of think I should do this, but we'd have to go to Nebraska. And that's not something you say.
Pass. No, thank you, please.
Yeah. And I don't think it's anything anyone expects to hear outside of the Midwest. And even if in the Midwest, not that often. But it turned out to be the right thing for us. And for my wife's career, it was not a detriment. It didn't cost her any time. And so I became I was actually the first person to apply, first person to get in. And if my colleagues from that year are listening, I don't say this at all to be less than totally respectful, but I was also the first person to graduate because I was the only one who finished my thesis on time. And so it's a meaningless distinction, but it's kind of a funny story, so I include that. But anyway, so I wrote my thesis on a body of law called the ITAR, International Traffic and Arms Regulations, which governs the international exchange of different types of technology. And I did that because at a conference early in the year, I asked a whole bunch of professionals, what should I study? I get to write this thesis, what should I study? And every one of them said ITAR. And it turned out to be the right call, and that's what got me my job at JPL. And I didn't stay in that role for very long, but it was the path to get there. And again, I could never have planned it.
So you never thought you'd be in New York to Nebraska to JPL?
No, I definitely moved to New York for my girlfriend, however much I try to justify it at the time as otherwise. And then we moved to Nebraska right after we got married. So we kind of had like a 9-month-long honeymoon in Nebraska, which I know is what every
And you're still together?
Yes. Yeah. It was a great, honestly, it was a very good growing experience for both of us, and wonderful. And it was in 2008. It was during the Obama election. So I couldn't have picked a better year historically to live in the Midwest. So that's a whole separate conversation. But anyway, yeah, I've had a pretty unexpected journey. Certainly didn't intend to leave JPL. My wife's surgical residency was assigned here in DC, which is why we're here. So that's sort of been my path, and I've been. Let me know if I'm rambling too much, but that's.
No, you're good.
No, you're fine. See, and when she read the intro and said space law, my mind immediately went to Charlie Kelly talking about bird law, and like, what is bird law? It's not something that actually exists, because not fans of Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
I am.
I've actually never seen the show, but I don't watch.
I know your reference, Dan, and
this interview is over.
All right.
but Dan, I did have the same thought. I just kept it in my head. But Dan.
So I will point out, that every one of you, both of you, I'm sure have seen an episode of a very treasured science fiction series about space law and probably don't remember it. The very first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation was about space law.
Oh,
if you go back and watch it, you will be shocked. You'll be shocked.
That's right.
For several reasons. You'll be shocked that the bizarre and ridiculous setting that pilot used, that they ever got to make any more episodes of that show. But then you will see it's an actual space law centered episode that uses the idea of a sort of supra-planetary legal system to put Picard's leadership and ethics to a test. And I can't think of any nerdier sentence that I have ever spoken out loud than that one I just said right now.
I mean, that might be one of the nerdiest things ever said on this podcast. So we've just set a new milestone. But you're right though, because I watched that pilot episode for the first time a few months ago, because I had never watched any Star Trek. Yeah, and it is a space court of law, so that it's a real thing in that episode.
I've never intentionally watched Star Trek. So
now it's my turn to say that the interview is over. We can all accept that we have ways to improve as people and move on.
Well, see, my reasoning behind it is I would hear how great it was, and because I'm too hipster to be a hipster, I would say no, I'm not going to watch that. And so I've just never gotten around to it. I'll probably watch it here in about 20 years. Like I was way late, like with Breaking Bad for that reason, and,
yeah,
because I'm being stubborn just to be stubborn, and I can't help it as much as I want to.
Breaking Bad
just for the sake of it. Yeah. All right. So things that we could agree on, though, is that space exploration is pretty cool. So I wanted to hear some, because we had a conversation in Quartermain about some of your favorite stories from kind of the history of space exploration. I mean, I have a favorite one that you told me, but there's probably stuff that happened before then. But I like the one about Mars and how they got that image back.
Yes,
that one. That's a rad story. But do you have another one that happened before then? But I like that one, and I want to.
Well, there's a couple, but I think that one, to me, you can see videos of people working in the 60s, and it looks like a different world. I mean, everything from the clothing to the haircuts to the all male cast. But what they did to get that first image of Mars up close down is the same thing that humans have been doing for thousands of years in applying ingenuity to a unsolvable problem. And I can get to that, but so I had a thought, but I think I lost it. But I'll go back. So one of my favorite so to me, one of my favorite parts about that conversation, Natalie, is when the gentleman next to us, who would look like he's in his 80s, spoke up and said, "Oh yeah, I was there during Apollo. He's right," and pointed at me and was like, basically validated what I was saying. I was like, wow.
Yeah, Dan, we were having this conversation just in the coffee shop, and the dude at the table next to us was obviously listening and listening very carefully to everything that Jeff was saying, because then he pulls out a card later and he pretty much was, I was at JPL during all of this. Yeah. And so small world, but this guy was just listening, and you can see the nostalgia, like in hearing about this. But I think that even just that interaction with this gentleman, who clearly all of this meant a lot to him, touches on something that I think is a thread that goes through a lot of these stories. Like when you talk about problem solving and ingenuity, NASA and space exploration, all of that, I feel like it, in a way, brings out and displays some of the best qualities of people. Because like when we were talking and you said to me, nature always wins. I mean, they're fighting the fact that nature will fuck you up, really. And it's people coming together to make extraordinary things happen. So I think people who have been associated with these projects must feel just awe and wonder and all of that, just at what together people can make happen.
Yeah, I spent my first year at JPL every spare minute in the library there, reading everything I could about all the old missions and just trying to go talk to the people who are still around. And I've had the privilege to work either for some of the project managers from the 60s and 70s and get some of my own ideas evaluated and vetted by the very senior people. And when you get to talk to them on a personal level, and they're not just enjoying the fact that they run humans, that they run robotic space exploration for the human species, they also have a profound sense of wonder that they happen to be alive at the right time. And most of them come from backgrounds where if you had said to them in the 1940s, hey, in the 1960s, you're going to be highly educated and responsible for the first human journeys from the Earth, none of the, I mean, it would have been just inconceivable. My wife's grandfather said to me recently that if you told me in 1943, when I was on a boat in the U.S. Navy, that I'd live to 2017 and meet my great grandchildren, it's like that there is nothing today so inconceivable as that was for them. And so I think that for our generation, it's easy to look up to these guys and they were all men at the time, and see these gods. But you know, they're people, and people make mistakes, and they're human. And so I think we learned quickly, we being the junior people of JPL, to sort of not deify them, but obviously put tremendous weight to whatever they tell us. And yeah, it was just an absolute privilege to be part of that. And that idea that nature always wins, when you're pushing the limits of what human technology can do, there's no room for the kinds of stuff that we've been fighting wars over for 10,000 years. And I enjoy working at that, in that regime. And I feel very lucky that I can. So.
Yeah. And so so obviously there's all the, you know, we're at the place now where, you know, we can see amazing pictures of what is up there, right? I mean, my kids, even the books, the children's books about space and all of this, have amazing pictures of all of the planets and stars and galaxies and all of that. But the first image of Mars came down pretty much like a paint by number.
Yes.
So we're in an amazing time where we take for granted almost all that we can see. But the first time they're looking for an image, can you talk through that process of where we were before?
I'll tell that story, and I'll try to go a little bit faster and a little there's a lot we could talk about. So in the late 60s, no, early 70s, when the Mariner program sent probes to Mars, they were building on what was sent to the moon for Apollo. And the first landers on the moon were robotic, and it took 7 or 8 tries to get there. The first 4 or 5 exploded on the launch pad. Then they missed the moon. First they failed to reach Earth orbit. Then they missed the moon. Then they fell out of the moon orbit. Then they crashed on the moon twice, I think. And then the camera didn't work on the moon. And then the camera worked on the 8th try or something. And that was just to get to the moon. Extending that to Mars was a very different challenge. And among the many things they could only do their best on was making sure they were pointing the camera at Mars at the right time, making sure they were within some range of Mars as they flew by. And when the first photo came back, through really what was the first digital camera, the computers that were going to print out the image or display the image were slower than the data stream coming back. And so they had a press conference in a room full of reporters waiting. And then the data from the image came back, and it was printing out on a ticker tape type of printer. And they realized, okay, we have to tell these reporters to wait for 2 hours. And you can imagine this is such a small amount of data for today. But long story short, they take the ticker tape, which basically had grayscale values on it, and they go up to a wall and they start with colored pencils plotting it in vertical scan lines. And the first vertical line is all black. And they're like, okay, well, we wouldn't expect anything there because it's just the edge, but maybe we missed entirely. Maybe the lens cap is on. Maybe the thing crashed into Mars. Maybe the camera exploded. Who knows? Second vertical line, and so on. Eventually, you know, you get to about an 1/8 or a 1/7 of the image, and it's all black. You start to worry, right? Maybe there's no image here. Suddenly, there's a little bit of white in the middle, which is the edge of the Martian atmosphere. The next vertical line is a little more and a little more. You can imagine these lines getting longer as you go, starting to show a disk. And that was humanity's first view up close of Mars. Sketched on a whiteboard with colored pencils. Well, not a whiteboard, sketched on like a piece of paper stuck to the wall with colored pencils, racing to provide something to the American public, because even after getting there, the computer that was going to show the image was too slow. And so they did it by hand. And nothing represents human space exploration better to me than that story. I mean, if you go back 50 years to the beginning of JPL in the 1930s, there's another, it's kind of related, but not as great of a story, that some people wanted to experiment with liquid fueled rockets at Caltech. And so they went to their faculty and said, hey, we want to do this. And the faculty member said something like, you know, you really shouldn't blow yourselves up here on campus. Go up to the mountains and blow yourselves up there. And so they went up there, and that is where JPL is today, 10 miles from Caltech. And not, you know, possibly because they were told, if you're going to blow yourselves up, do it where nobody can see you. And the Caltech faculty did not like it when I told that story when I was still an employee, but now I can tell it. So
blow yourselves up on the hill or somewhere outside.
So,
you know?
so the early days of this stuff were so unlike what we have today, and even what we have today is wonderful. That it strains belief, but that's what it took. And that's to say nothing of the remarkably coincidental geopolitical landscape that was happening in the world around the time that humanity developed the technology to do this. You could imagine a world war 100 years earlier or later that created the intense geopolitical landscape that led to the massive investment that was Apollo. But if humanity didn't have microcontrollers yet, or if we didn't have radio communication yet, well, too bad. Space wasn't going to be the arena that conflict unfolded in. So it's just an incredible thing to have ever happened, you know, and you know, I think about the fact that probably within 10 years, there will no longer be anyone alive that walked on the moon. Hopefully longer.
Wow.
And I would be so ashamed to tell my kids and other kids, there's no living person that walked on the moon, and they'll say, but we went, didn't we? And I'll say, yeah. And they'll say, why didn't we go? And I will have I have an answer, but it will be too depressing to tell them until they're teenagers at least. But that to me is very profound. And the fact that we haven't gone back, or no human has gone back, really represents the lack of that scale of conflict in the world. So yeah.
So was it?
Answer again.
So it was like was it a lot just due to that idea of this race for space to get there? And
what I took away from that was that we have Hitler to thank for landing on the moon.
Oh,
well, that's not.
That's what I heard. I heard you say, well, thanks, Hitler.
Hitler initiated the conflict that set the stage for the Soviet Union and the U.S. to compete for leadership.
Right.
In the 50s.
I was joking. Maybe.
Well, you know,
my child is being loud in the background. Carson.
You know,
Carson.
I'm not sure I can bring myself.
Hold on a second. Hold on.
Sure. I'm not sure I can bring myself to say thanks Hitler in anything but repeating someone else, but it's no exaggeration to plot that, you know.
Well, no, it's because it is.
This is why I wanted to. I didn't really want to do a live video.
Sure.
Carson, we just talked about this.
Because children on Christmas break.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will. Let me make a note here.
Okay. Thanks.
But the bigger observation
might not be familiar with my sense of humor. That was a joke.
Oh, I know. I got it. I got it. But it's real. I mean,
there's some proof there because
in a very real sense. If not for the absolutely madcap pace of the German war machine in the 40s, that level of missile technology might not have been developed around the world to the point where 10 years later we could actually start throwing stuff off the planet. And
well, yeah, because I think a lot of people don't realize like the Gemini missions were that was all literally on top of an ICBM, on top of something that's supposed to be, instead of delivering a warhead somewhere, we're putting someone in space for 10-15 minutes at a time.
Yeah, and it was, as far as I know, it was really only, I believe, in the 1908 or maybe it was 1916, the first scientific publication that said, here's how we actually put something in space. And by the way, we have the chemical technology we can do. Oh, by the way, that gets me to another really interesting thing. So another really lucky thing is that if the Earth was, I forgot the number, but if the Earth was like 20% more massive.
I thought you were going to say flat.
If the Earth was 20% more massive, chemical rockets would not have enough, I'm sorry, they would work, but they wouldn't get us into orbit. It would be impossible to do the staging that we do, or at least the way we used to do it, with chemical fuels if the Earth was 20% more massive, assuming that the chemistry was the same. So, and again, that's another wonderful coincidence that liquid fuel and chemical technology was where it was in the 50s.
And of course, I am not a rocket scientist of any kind, but wouldn't that just affect? Because I mean, you have a rocket motor that has whatever the thrust level it is. Wouldn't you just have to make everything else that much lighter, or just carry less stuff?
So if I see where you're going with that, and if in the 50s they had, well, so let me make it a slightly bit more complicated. The metals that we were able to build large structures out of in the 50s.
Oh, gotcha.
Much heavier than what we have now. Maybe you could do it with modern metals and modern custom material,
I see what you're saying,
built for this purpose. But that alignment between metal, material science and chemical rocketry, if either of those were a little off, wouldn't have been able to do it at that time. So now that's admittedly one of a billion possible scenarios, but given how hard it is to leave the planet, all of those things fell into place pretty conveniently.
So you're kind of talking this like perfect storm of the technology at the right time, and then the motivation at the right time too, right? Because people wanted to, they were motivated, countries were motivated to race up there, and the technology was able to be harnessed enough to do so.
Right. And almost just for sheer curiosity, I pointed out that some of the stuff we don't typically think about, like the mass of the Earth and the chemical energy content of liquid hydrogen, those two things, well, the chemical energy content of liquid hydrogen is set a long time ago, even before the Earth was formed. But if the Earth had formed differently, humans would not have been able to leave it when we did. And I just think that's fascinating because it's not something you typically think about. But I tend to way overthink, as you guys will see the more you think.
But so all of this happened, and it was a really exciting time, it seemed like, to be kind of alive and around and active in the height of getting to the moon, seeing Mars, all of that. And then, like you said, pretty soon we will be at a point where nobody who is alive will have walked on the moon. So what happened?
What happened? Well, so when NASA was formed in 1957, it was sort of an evolved version of an agency called the National Aerospace. It was NACA. I should really know what that is, but anyway, the NACA itself was a civil air travel agency established in the 1916 or something, and it was massively expanded to include space with the Space Act of 1957. And that was shortly after DARPA was established. DARPA is relevant here because DARPA's role specifically was to prevent something like Sputnik from ever happening again, specifically preventing the technological surprise of an adversary. And that is still DARPA's mission. So, but anyway, NASA was the agency that was set, that was a civil agency created to go to the moon. And well, not created to go to the moon, but created to compete with the Soviets in space. And unlike any number of other agencies today, that was a really big deal at the time. World War II was still fresh in everyone's mind. The Korean War was going on. And so there was this just unprecedented level of motivation for this. And as I've learned so I talk to kids at schools and I talk to people in nursing homes. I go the whole range. And I like talking to people in nursing homes because I hear things like, I'll see a person who was asleep for my entire talk wake up and say, directly make eye contact with me and say, in the 1950s was the scariest time of our lives because of the Soviet Union and space, and then go back to sleep. And that is not something any of us can really understand, the level of fear and motivation to surpass the Soviet Union. So that was a motivation to get to Kennedy's "We'll go to the moon" speech. And there's some really interesting stuff there, mostly involving how little Kennedy himself actually knew about science, and some theories that if he was better educated in science, he might never have said that, because he would have known how ridiculous it was. And it was truly absurd at the time.
Well, he said they choose to go to the moon because not because it's easy, because it's hard, and do the other things, which I think is the most unfortunate quote, or like part of that whole quote, because everything else is so great, and it goes, and the other things, and it cracks every time I hear him, like see that video of it. Like my girlfriend and I, like we just start cracking up, because it's like, that's so eloquent, and then the other things, and
I think that I don't remember the rest of that paragraph, but yeah, it's an odd one. But and so then that got the resources going. And by the way, in the 60s, the amount of money going to NASA was not uncontroversial. In 1966, it peaked at 5% of GDP, and I'm sorry, 5% of the federal budget, even bigger. Which and now it's 0.05%. So, or maybe it's 0.5.
It's half. Yeah, it's half. It's
0.5%.
Yeah.
Not 0.05. But so when we got to the moon, NASA really had a sort of identity crisis. And by the way, in early 1969, there were studies commissioned of how to use that same equipment to go to Mars. The assumption had been made at some level in NASA that, well, we're going to keep going. And
it's just that easy, right?
Unfortunately, oh, let me go take a step back earlier in the 60s. So there are a lot of thinking that if Kennedy had not been assassinated, they never would have finished Apollo. It was that controversial even then, and expensive even then. And but from what I've read, there was a strong public opposition to ending his legacy because he had been killed. And so one can only wonder, had that not happened, what might have happened. But anyway, so we get to 1969 and then 1972, and most of the Apollo mission, all but one of the Apollo missions, have been a great success, although many of them had very close calls. But so then, unfortunately, Richard Nixon was the president, and until very recently, from what I've read about Nixon, I just couldn't imagine a person actually being like that, actually thinking like that. Recent events have shown me the world is full of such people, sadly. But Nixon looked at NASA and saw, okay, we beat the Soviets, that's it, go home. And because you never really end a government program once it gets started, what effectively happened was NASA would eventually be forced to compete for budget priority with the other agencies. And that has set NASA on a path of conflict and struggle that it's still on today, because it's just a different magnitude of effort. And for several decades, so it wasn't really, so that property of NASA was actually weaponized in the early 2000s in order to score political points and defer tough decisions on things like the shuttle and Constellation and now Mars. But between Apollo and the 90s, in my opinion, there was this sort of new identity for NASA emerging. Also, the lack of a major geopolitical conflict that could be fought in space. I mean, I don't fought literally. I mean, fought figuratively. They beat the Soviets so early, but the Soviet Union took another 20 years to collapse. Can almost imagine, what if the Soviets had gone to Mars instead of the moon? Then maybe we'd have gone to Mars, and then they'd have gone to who knows where. But so So NASA today exists in this, it's semi-protected because so this is a theory of mine that it's actually got a small enough budget. It's not worth the headache for most politicians to try to steal from. And it has pretty broad bipartisan support. And even when the current president includes in his request some fairly devastating changes, they're rejected offhand in the House and the Senate. And so that's good, I guess. I would like to see a civilization that has a different relationship with space exploration, but we're not there yet. So, so that is kind of why we stopped going to the moon. And I believe that the Chinese will land people on the moon by 2030. And then hopefully we'll be on our way to Mars in the mid-2030s. But NASA
and yeah, I was gonna ask you, do you think, because I have my own very strong opinion about this, but I'm interested to hear somebody, I guess, that's more, I guess, educated and knowledgeable on this. Do you think that we should try to go to the moon, or do you think we should just continue forward Elon Musk style and try to hit Mars?
Well, so there's a lot to unpack there.
Right. I know.
I think sometimes I think about the interesting property of human exploration of space before the moon landing. When your entire species has spent 10,000 years walking upright on the Earth and has never left, the moon is the obvious place to go. Just to do it, because it's there and you can. Yeah. But then the question becomes much more difficult. Also, the actual challenge becomes much more difficult, but even before then, the question of goals and motivations becomes much more difficult. The question of whether we should go back to the moon or Mars really depends on what you want NASA's role to be.
Well, I think in general, people who want us to go to Mars are wanting to establish a Martian colony there, and into the ridiculous notion that we can terraform Mars, even though we can't even begin to terraform Earth. Well, I let my bias kind of slip out in that.
Sure. So let me. I would like, if there's one thing I'd like the listeners to take from this, is that we are not technologically precluded from doing these things. We are precluded only by leadership and will. If we decided to, we could get people on Mars within 10 or 15 years. If we decided to, we could get people on the moon faster than that, and maybe even living there. I don't know about detonating nuclear bombs at the poles of Mars the way Elon Musk has maybe.
Oh, I haven't heard that.
Maybe joked about, but all you really need to do to warm up a planet is to add a bunch of energy to it, and who knows. But the bigger point is that these things have not been done, not because they cannot be done, but because we have not chosen to do them. And that is a shame, because we chose to do something ridiculously hard 50 years ago, and then we did it. So I currently think, given that the Commercial Crew Program, which was NASA's way of getting companies, the private sector sort of, to build rockets for it, given that that appears to be fairly successful, that the best thing NASA could do is establish a goal of, let's say, returning to the moon, but doing it with a commercial system. And what that would do is, unlike Apollo, which created an infrastructure that could not be continued or justified at its cost, commercial organizations could potentially create the kinds of equipment and systems that you would need on a continuing basis for a colony on another planet or on a moon. Any such facility on the moon would require continuous transport back and forth, all kinds of other infrastructure that maybe could pay for itself. I don't know, but I don't think NASA should be building everything. It's just too much. Now, then the question is, would you want to go live in a building on the moon built by Halliburton? I don't know. But
I was going to say everything's made in China, put
Right.
together by an 8-year-old in a factory in China.
Yeah. So
with Chinese.
Now, there's the question of whether we go back to the moon or go straight to Mars is almost, there is no right answer. I think it's
I think the right answer is we go back to the moon, because even if where the idea is from what I gather, most people's idea to go to Mars is, hey, let's start a base somewhere else, show that we can live on another planet, and that'll be a step towards us being, having at least some part of our civilization being, either permanently living on another planet or, Star Trek style, roaming about the galaxy like that. I think it's ridiculous to try to take such a huge step like that, and that just with everything, and with everything that, at least from what I've seen and understand about how space exploration works like that, you need to establish proof of concept. You need to show that this can work, even if it's small scale. We need to, it's a lot easier to resupply somebody, or something breaks and or there's some sort of emergency. It's a 3-day trip, where I at least last time we went, it's a 3-day trip to the moon. It's a, depending on where Mars is at, it's what, 9 months to get to Mars, or 6 months.
Right, and you can't leave most of the time. You can't even leave. Now, those are all really good points. And
I know, thank you.
What they speak to is a level of planning and organization that our species has not yet achieved.
Mm-hmm.
For us to have a moon colony, maybe could be achieved by a single nation at great continuing expense.
Mm-hmm.
For us to have us as in humanity, to have a Mars colony will require human collaboration and partnership on a level that has never happened, because of the way we choose to govern ourselves here on Earth. It may be possible.
We're still busy fighting over whose god is better than the other. Right. So yeah, we got a ways to go.
Right. We fight about that, and we fight over dead animal guts in the ground. And as long as we can choose to continue doing so, I don't think we're going to get people on Mars, except maybe just to say we did. And that I don't think is good enough. Now, one thing that might actually economically stimulate the development of the technologies you need to do these things is asteroid mining. And that is slowly increasing in credibility over the last few years. From what I gather from the Chinese state media report that they did on on their official 50-year plan, that appears to be where they're going. And unlike the US, they have the ability to make 30-year plans and do them. And it's also a direct continuation of their, at the risk of oversimplifying, their economic position of getting control of the valuable resources of the Earth, all over the Earth, and then being the rest of the planet's supplier of raw materials and stuff made from them. So by 2050, if we're not mining the asteroids, the Chinese will be. I like to think that maybe by then we will be bigger than just the US, but the old habits die hard. So that is a whole separate world. In my opinion, NASA, something NASA can do really well is create these goals for the commercial sector and nudge them along. But the problem is NASA has this huge tension between doing new things and sustaining its huge workforce to buy senators. And that component, the heavy concentration of NASA employees in the South, is the reason for a lot of NASA's direction or lack thereov in the last 50 years. we're still building stuff derived from Apollo because there's 100,000 jobs. They have people who vote that work in those facilities. You could almost call it a downside. One of the quasi downsides of Apollo is we built an incredibly large infrastructure to do 7 launches. And then we spent the last 50 years trying to avoid moving away from that infrastructure, which is why the space shuttle was designed the way it was, and why even now the same facilities that built the Saturn V are building the SLS at the cost. The cost is to innovation. So when you have to keep a whole bunch of 3rd generation shuttle or Saturn V rocket engineers and technicians busy, it's hard to try new things.
And that's for people who don't know what SLS is, that's the space launch system, the super ridiculous heavy launcher that's supposed to be able to get us to Mars.
So it's also called the Senate launch system because about 8 years ago, it was pretty literally requested by the dominant senators of the time, saying basically, we can't keep building shuttles, but we need something else that's not so different from the shuttle that my constituents can keep building, so we don't have to lose any NASA jobs in my district. So that's a very real tension that NASA has that it really didn't have during Apollo, and we see this tension played out every 4 years for the last 20, as NASA is given a long-term enough goal to justify continuing to spend a lot of money, but not enough money or autonomy to actually get to the goal. So I don't have a solution for that. Maybe Elon Musk will get us to Mars. He might. But
or he'll just buy North Korea and their nuclear weapon program and just fly some nukes there, maybe.
But this is not how you run a space program focused on exploration, in my opinion. It does a lot of amazing things, but it could do a lot more, and our society has to desire it and prioritize it.
And I don't know how this would happen or how to do this. That's for somebody much smarter than me. But I think I think the asteroid mining thing, once that becomes once something happens that it makes it more practical for us to to do that. I mean, we've landed kind of a probe already on a comet, so that's there's that was ESA did that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So there's some proof of concept there that it can be done, that we can send this thing millions and billions of miles away and plop it down kind of in one piece on a rock that's moving and turning, however it is, or in a comet, who knows. So I think once it gets to a point that's more feasible and that's not just like a such a holy shit moment, I think more companies are going to see that, well, maybe we can, the companies that are kind of like SpaceX, but not quite, such as big of a risk takers, maybe will say, well, yeah, I can put money into that. I see value in this, that we're going to get, however many tons of this material that's super rare here, but this entire asteroid is just made out of it. I think once that happens, I think that will spur a lot, but I don't know how we get there.
It's getting to that point to have something act as a catalyst for future.
Right. Yeah. And because there's going to be innovation that has to happen in order to make that happen. And every step of the way through space exploration. And that's getting back to you congratulating Hitler on us landing on the moon. That's something that, like, World War II is just one of the many reasons why it's just so fascinating to me, is that we such a dark period in the history of humanity, we can unquestionably point directly to and say this awful stretch of time is exactly why we have so much
Yeah.
technology that we have today, is that we have so much knowledge and innovation and everything like that, and also why I stay up to 3 a.m. watching documentaries on Netflix about World War II. But it's so that just blows me away, and to think that, like you said, if we didn't have that, like if we didn't have that awful period of time, and of course, we're not saying that that's a good thing. No, he didn't actually think Hitler. But if we didn't have that, you just have to kind of wonder where we'd be. We definitely wouldn't have landed on the moon when we did. That wouldn't have been even. Who knows? We may not have even had ICBMs at that point in time. So it's just kind of I don't know what the word is. It's kind of weird to think about.
Yeah, there's a slight tangent from space, but apparently the Civil War was a major driver of the development of anesthesia.
Yeah.
So many people were held down, bite
the bullet,
liquored up while their gangrenous legs were cut off. Yeah. That I guess some people said, we really got to find a better way to deal with this than stuff.
Yeah.
Doctor's just like, I am tired of this guy yelling. Can we just shut him up?
The doctor's like, you know what, guys? When this is over, we got to figure out a better way to deal with this. But so it's not unheard of that major advances in technology come out of wartime. But it's too bad that's what it takes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and that's not something we have to keep doing as a society. We choose to function that way.
All right. So question then, because obviously, these are the big questions of how do we advance? How do we do better?
Mm.
So I know something that you're also passionate about is communicating science to young people. And it's something that we talk about a lot here is how do we help the next generation and the generation after that of decision makers make better decisions and, make the advances for the right reasons, not just as a reaction to catastrophe, maybe. Maybe that could happen. So how do we, encourage critical thinking and all of that?
So I can only speak from some experiences I've had. My dad he never treated me like a little kid when I asked a why question. Mm-hmm. I don't think he ever said, because that's the way it is. When I said, and now as a father myself, I get a lot of why questions, and sometimes I'm so tired I wish I could just live with myself and say, because that's the rule. But I really, really try to give my kids, and anyone's kids who ask me about this stuff, a real answer, even if it involves terms I know they don't know, I know they can't pronounce. I'll kind of bring it down to their level, but I give them enough. I try to give them an answer that makes them want to ask another question. So my son asked me today, how does a platypus find its food? And the answer is it involves an organ in the platypus that generates an electric field that the platypus can sense some object in the. And so I said to him, the platypus has an organ that he's 5.5 that generates an electric field, and it somehow, I don't know the full answer, it somehow senses that the presence of something in that field. And I know he doesn't really know what fields are in that sense. And so he asked me, I said, well, so I looked around the room and I thought, well, okay, the lamp is also generating an electromagnetic field, but just mostly light. So, and then I brought it back to like a bat using sonar, which he knows, or echolocation. And so I just sort of let my mind wander to answer questions in ways that are relatable. And that's how I write my podcasts, and that's how I really answer anyone's question. So I guess I just try not to treat kids like kids when they ask that question. When they ask real questions, they want real answers. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, either if you don't know the answer, that's fine. You say, let's look it up together. But adults have to think that way before they can possibly help kids to think that way. So and I never missed a chance to drop an interesting tidbit with adults. For example, today I was at my son's class for a little holiday party, and for some reason it popped into my head to tell them that the Star of Bethlehem from the Bible was probably a supernova in the Andromeda galaxy, and that there's evidence of that being a supernova recorded across the world at that time, and where we now know we can project back where it was, and there was a supernova about very close to that region of the sky. Point being that it's a chance to connect a Christmas story, a holiday story, to real science. And now I recognize that interjecting science with religion is not the best way always to.
Well, that also happened during the summer, like in June.
Okay. Yeah.
So I mean, I'm just off by maybe 6 months when they set the date. Not that, anyway, yeah. But to your point, yes.
So and again, I'm hardly not an educated person in the religious areas, but I think it's important to look at human history from the point of view of modern science. I mean, most people find that pretty interesting. You have to be pretty diehard zealot to not at least find that interesting. You don't have to change your thinking on religion to find that interesting. So I guess I just sort of treat kids as people when they ask questions, no matter how small they are. And sometimes there's no way to answer the question that they'll understand, and so you try, and I've found that they'll come back. Every kid is a scientist, I think. I mean, every human being is born a scientist, and some of them survive the process to beat it out of them and become professional scientists. But there's this great meme, or it's like a comic, where there's two babies acting out the scientific method, and one of them like eats something and puke, and then it's like gathering evidence, sharing your findings, inviting a reproduction of the experiment, and the kid hands the same thing to another baby, and the other baby also puked, and it's like fair validation. So, but I mean, that is how I think that's one of the most wonderful things about being a parent to me, is to watch my children's minds do that naturally.
Yeah, and I guess it's really just about nurturing that inquisitive spirit in children, and just continuing to help them learn how to learn and learn what interests them, and like stoke that fire of like just passion for knowledge. And hopefully, if all of us continue to do that and pay it forward and all of that, you have to be hopeful. I mean, I think you have to be, because otherwise, what's the point,
Right. I mean, I think the arc of time bends towards progress. You can only deceive. I mean, there are active forces of disinformation out there. There are active forces of darkness who would take knowledge away, or worse, misinform, and that's a very real threat. But you can only lie. You can only tell starving people they're not starving for so long, And one of the interesting things about the way our system works nationally and globally today is that it's possible to deny cause and effect to large groups of people for many years, and then when it becomes an unavoidable issue, to then blame the other guy. And I think it's a relatively new issue in world affairs that we really need to find a way to manage, or we are going to have deliberate backsliding into the, I don't know, I'm not going to say Stone Age, but we see, like, from your vaccine denier people, there are people who would take us backwards, and maybe they even think their heart might even be in the right place. And it's a privilege to deny that kind of thing, because first you have to not get killed by the cold when you're 3 to grow up and then deny that the vaccine works. So I'm sure we could talk about that, but anyway, so it's a very important thing. It's a very important thing. And in a time of total ignorance about how the universe worked, like 5,000 years ago, not a big of a deal. But progress is a choice. Everyone is born with nothing, with no actual knowledge, and could be turned to advance knowledge and progress, or the reverse.
Yeah. And so, I mean, all we can do is help kind of guide the next generation towards progress, and all of us doing what we can now to make it as good as possible. And obviously that's something that you're doing with your science outreach and podcasting and everything. And so as we wrap up tonight, can you plug all of your projects? And before that, actually, let me congratulate you on your Discovery Superhero Award, Science Superhero Award. So congrats on that. We'll put a link to that in our show notes too, because that's pretty rad.
Thank you. That was really, I can only think of, there's like very few other things that are that rewarding to me than for the Science Channel to recognize my efforts. So that's,
so that's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a podcast. I started it recently. It's called 5 Minute Science. And I talk about topics, interesting connections in nature, in 5 minutes or less. I never actually even hit 5 minutes, but you can go to 5minutescience.com. That's number 5 and then Minute Science. And there's some other stuff there as a YouTube channel and some super geeky t-shirts. But I'm really interested in seeing where I can take this, because after I got that Science Channel recognition, I thought, wow, I can do a lot. I can reach a lot more people than this school here and that school there, and so on. So I really would like to be able to keep doing it and eventually take requests. Actually, I did get a request today. A kid asked me why their apples turn brown so quickly. So just think of all the things that you can go from there. You can go into oxidation and basic chemistry, and
the fact that they don't necessarily have to with genetic modification.
Right. And you can just keep that conversation going with that kid for, we really have as adults, we really have the power to shape that interest. It's possible to answer that question in a boring way that makes someone never look at science again, ever, and maybe go work on Wall Street or something. But it's also possible to answer that question in a way that lights a fire that they just want to know. So.
And so that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
Light the fire and keep it going. So thank you so much for talking to us about all of these topics tonight. And yes, and thank you again, Dan, for making stickers that led to the conversation that made this possible. So we'll link to the stickers in the show notes too.
Cool.
All right. Thank you guys.